Good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome all the people in person, students, faculty, and other guests back to the William & Mary campus. And I would like to thank everyone in person and virtual for joining us today for the first Asian Centennial APIA Banh Mi Lecture of the Year with our own professor, Andrea Wright. My name is Dinesh Sahoni, and I am the director of APIA. And with Francis, I am the co-chair of the Asian Centennial. And so this year, we are celebrating 100 years of the first Asian ancestry student and probably the first student of color at William & Mary. So most of you have seen, hopefully, our extensive advertising of all the events that are going on campus. And all of these events are built around this centennial. And one of the original student who came here in 1921 was PK Chan, and at the SWEM library will be in a week or so having an exhibit. But this commemoration is not just about an individual student. More than that, we want to, Asian Centennial seeks to highlight the history and legacy of Asian Pacific Islander, American and Middle Eastern Muslim students, faculty, staff at William & Mary, and develop a platform for programming that opens conversations on how to continue to build a more inclusive community and William & Mary and beyond. Today, in addition to giving the first Asian Centennial API Banh Mi talk of the year, Professor Andrea Wright will also be honored as the first recipient of the Jinlan Liu Faculty Research Award. Before I formally introduce Professor Wright, Professor Aguas is going to talk a little bit about the award that we'll be giving to Professor Wright.
And that would be me on the camera.
You want me to hold it?
Mic test. So hello, everybody online. We are live streaming on YouTube, and we are here at Sadler. My name is Francis Tanglao Aguas. I am the co-chair of the Asian Centennial Committee and the director of Global Studies. It gives me great pleasure to tell you a little story about the Jinlan Liu APIA Faculty Research Award. And basically, the premise of the Jinlan Liu Faculty Research Award is rooted in the commitment of not only our students, but also their families in the engagement of research about and towards the histories, contributions, and experiences of the communities within the Asian Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian communities of Virginia and beyond. Ben Ming Zhang, 2016, was a major in APIA, still self-designed back then. On his senior year, he wrote a thesis on art matsu, as Professor Sohoni mentioned. But as he was pursuing that thesis, he was also running for city council. On the day that he received his honors thesis was the day he won election. And on that very day, his mom, Mrs. Jinlan Liu, also came to witness the honors thesis. And at the end of it all, she showed her commitment to us in an appreciation. And by us, I mean all of us in APIA and the study of Asian, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asians in the United States, by committing their support through their Hanzang and Jinlan Liu Family Foundation to support our efforts. The Jinlan Liu Faculty APIA Research Award is meant to honor the participation and contribution of our colleagues who are not contractually obligated to contribute to our efforts, but do so out of their commitment to diversifying the curriculum, honoring the community, and giving all of you a wonderful and deep education. The Jinlan Liu Faculty Research Endowment is $100,000 that the family has donated over a period of 4 years. Professor Wright will be the holder of the award for, I think, 3 to 4 years. So it shows the commitment of APIA to Professor Wright and in recognition of Professor Wright's contribution. She teaches many courses, primary of which is the shared simultaneous capstone with Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, our esteemed sibling program. Warm welcome to our director, Professor Ann Rasmussen. I want to express again our gratitude to the Hanzang and Jinlan Liu Family Foundation This is not their first contribution to APIA. Many of you know Professor Benedito Ferrao. We still have Professor Ferrao because on that day that Professor Ferrao led the honors thesis of Benming Zhang, the first major donation of the Han Zhang Foundation was towards the retention of Professor Bene Ferrao for an extension of 1 year on their contract. And we are very transparent. They donated $30,000, which was about 50% of the salary and benefits of $60,000 of a faculty member for 1 year. This is the kind of commitment without which our program would not even be here today. So we thank you, we thank your families, and especially to the Han Zhang and Jinlan Liu Family Foundation. Dr. Zhang, Mrs. Liu, thank you very much.
So our speaker today is Professor Andrea Wright. And Andrea Wright is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Asian Middle Eastern Studies at William & Mary. And as Professor Aguas has already mentioned, she contributes greatly to the APIA program, particularly with respect to our capstone course. Professor Wright's research includes energy, infrastructure, labor, migration, security, with a geographic emphasis on India, Pakistan, and the Gulf. Her first book, Between Dreams and Ghosts, Indian Migration and Middle Eastern Oil, is an ethnography of Indian migration to oil and gas projects in the Gulf. Today, she's going to be talking about two of her more current projects, her research on labor and oil production in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, and her new comparative research on energy and the environment in 3 different geographical regions. So I'm super excited, first for her being the first recipient of the Jinlan Liu Award, and also to hear about her current projects. So without further ado, I will let Professor Andrea Wright take over. But one last announcement. Since this is a banh mi series, we're super excited that we're back in person. So we will have some banh mi sandwiches, but because of COVID, it's a take home. You can grab the sandwiches after the talk, and we can either go outside if the rain is cooperating and talk outside, but make sure to grab some of the sandwiches. And thank you, Andrea.
Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for the award, and thank you to the Jinlan Liu donation family for giving that. It's such an honor to be part of APIA and to have the program as a space in which to participate. So I'm really just thankful to have that opportunity. Hopefully a screen will turn on, but mostly I just have pictures to show you as I talk so that you have something exciting to me. Oh, there we go. It's very big. Okay, so what I wanted to talk, I imagine it's better with the microphone. So what I wanted to talk with you about today. Oh,
You can move around. Yes.
I can walk around.
Yes.
Okay. So what I wanted to talk with you about today, though, is the work that I do that emerges from over a dozen years of working with men who work with labor and oil projects and who move from India to the Gulf. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my book that's about to come out, just because I think it helps situate the other 2 projects that I have. And that book is Between Dreams and Ghosts. And what this book does is I follow men as they migrate from their villages in India to major cities in India, where they look for jobs with oil companies, and then I follow them to sites in the Gulf, largely in the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, and then back again. And what I want to know about is their life and their experiences. But what happened through my engagement with my interlocutors is I began to think a lot about how labor and energy are interwrapped with things like corporations and governance and the nation states, but also how inequality becomes produced around these sites and how we kind of naturalize the inequalities that are produced in these ways. And so what one of the, here's the map that you can see. Many of the men who migrate come from rural areas in northeastern India where agriculture is the primary way of making a living, and most people work as day laborers or casual laborers, and they earn on average $2 to $3 a day. So moving to work in a country like the United Arab Emirates, UAE, or Qatar, Bahrain, allows people to make 10, 12 times what they might make if they were at home in their villages. One young man I met as I did my research is Ahmed, who lived in the Uttar Pradesh, which is a state in northeastern India. And when I met him, he was looking for a job in the fall. And so he went to an interview that I happened to be at, and he wasn't hired that day. But after the interview, where he had demonstrated his strength by carrying loads of rocks across the courtyard because they were having people who could carry heavy loads, he began to show me around his village. And he showed me this house he pointed to. And he said, look at this house. They're building a pucca house, or a house made out of concrete bricks. And this type of house can be contrasted with a kacha house, or a house made out of mud and thatch, right? So they're building a house that's made out of these permanent building structures, and they've been able to buy a tractor and more ramps. They're able to increase their farm productivity, get out of debt, and they were able to do this through having a son who was involved. And he said, that's why it's my dream to go and work in golf, so that I can do these things for my family. In addition, he told me he wanted to help contribute to his sister's salary and buy gold so that she could get married, as his family was in debt and didn't have any extra money for really anything beyond the basic necessities. So men migrate, but once they get to the Gulf, they often have challenging working situations. Even in the best case scenarios, labor laws are written so that the employer has most of the power. And so in the worst case scenarios, men may end up, as these men were abandoned by their employers, so they're fled the country, and they were left in Sharjah, which is a city in the United Arab Emirates, a state. And they didn't have their passports. They had not been paid the 2 years that they worked in the Gulf, and they had no way to get home. And their families had no way to buy them a plane ticket. They also had no electricity, no access to running water, and no food. So they were dependent upon people in neighboring camps to help support them and give them these things. And so eventually these men, we were able to raise money for these men to buy home. But this is not the most uncommon, because these labor laws are really not written to favor workers. And one example of this is that workers are unable to strike. And so this is a very rare wildcat strike, which means not formally organized by union. Workers are unable to unionize, ask for better working conditions. So even if they're not in these extreme cases of abandonment, they're still not able to just get together and say, hey, we want to make more money, or we want to work shorter hours. We don't want to work for overtime. These types of things. So often, when people talk about why labor conditions are like this, the reason is that the people who, the citizens of the Arabic-speaking Gulf, so places like the United Arab Emirates or Qatar, have retained the relationships from pre-oil days, which was like slave owner type relations. And the argument is that these conditions stem from that understanding of labor. And as I'm sure many of you take an introduction to Asian Middle Eastern studies or API, we always want to question when it's a failure to modernize. And this leads to my second project, which again looks at this migration, but I move backwards in time. And I look at it from the late 1930s to the early 1970s. And I began to look at the archives, the oil companies, the archives, the colonial government in the area. And I looked at how labor laws were written. And as I did so, I began to see how race and nationality began to inform how workers were treated and the policies that emerged. So this is a book that I'm currently finishing called Producing Labor Hierarchies. And what I do in this book, or part of what I do in this book, is I look at strikes that Indian laborers participated in at 3 sites. So in Aden, which is today in Yemen, in Bahrain, and then also at Abidan, which is in Iran. And so I compare these strikes and I compare how oil companies responded to them and what happens afterwards. And the earliest strike happens in Abidan, or the early strikes that I read happen in Abidan. And what these strikes are at the oil refinery that's located there in Iran. And they're, at the time, the oil refinery is the largest oil refinery in the world. It's run by the Anglo-Arabian Oil Company, which is today called British Petroleum. And it ends with, eventually in 1951, these series of strikes end with the nationalization of both oil and the refinery, which is very upsetting to both the British Oil Company as well as the British government, which had a controlling stake in the oil industry. So these strikes, when we look at them, often scholars talk about them as strikes by Iranians, which makes a lot of sense. But when we actually look at the strikes, we find that Indians are striking alongside Iranian workers, and they're striking alongside workers from other parts of the Middle East. And there's a solidarity that's being built by people living together and working together and imagining the world. And so this is largely class-based, and it's happening in the 1940s. Now, as you can imagine, there's a lot of negative response to losing one's oil refinery. And so oil companies begin to implement certain policies as they move. So as they move to Bahrain and Aden, they begin building a new refinery. And they start actually bringing consciously in from the Jim Crow South policies of racial segregation between workers. And while this is happening, we also see India's independence happen in 1947. So as workers are being forced to live in separate places, they also have this ability for Indians to appeal to the Indian government because it's become a newly independent state. In Bahrain, we see 8 chemists who are fired for complaining about the racism with which they're treated by their employer. So they worked for the Bahrain Petroleum Oil Company, and they complained because they said that the managers were just disparaged them in the worst, like with racial slurs, and that they were also not paid as well as other workers. And so in response, the oil company said, in this way, they said, we're not responsible for international differences in scales of pay. And so it's not our fault that we pay Indian workers less than we pay European workers. That's just the way the economy works. But of course, it re-entrenches these differences, and they're making workers stay in different places and giving them different jobs based on where they come from. This also continues at Aden, where all of the Indian workers actually end up working together to have a series of hunger strikes. And again, make arguments about both racism and their abuse of their human rights. And they appeal to the Indian government to protect these rights. Now, what is striking though is we see a move from the 1940s, where there's a lot of strikes with Iranian and Arabic-speaking workers, to a moment where only Indians are striking together. And we find that these strikes, influenced by things like racial segregation and these logics of management logics in which they're trying to separate and segregate workers, they also seem to make the strikes less effective. And workers also are recognizing that, and they're also making new arguments. They're making arguments that their nation state, the Indian government in this case, needs to protect their rights. And they're making arguments about how to form a community and what it means to be Indian, who's a part of the Indian nation. And so it's an interesting situation because in some ways it's reinforcing these ideas of difference between nationalities or between groups, but in other ways it's really making a compelling argument for who ensures a citizen's rights and what should those rights be. And what I am trying to unpack as I do this is how understandings of race and nationality become back down to each other, and ethnicity and race become connected, but also how these change over the course of the 20th century and how understanding of energy and labor change. Now, from there, so I went from kind of looking at what's happening right now to looking at what happened in the past, and now I want to think about how people are thinking about the future. And this project, again, is looking at labor and energy and governance. And then again, it emerges out of this interest in my earlier research. But what I'm doing now is I'm comparing 3 green energy projects, one in Kuwait, one in India, and one in Virginia. And the reason this came to my attention was when I was in Kuwait recently. I was speaking with an oil company manager, and he said, "Oh, we are actually building the same refinery that we're building here in Kuwait, both in India and in Virginia." Yeah, so isn't that interesting for you? And I was like, yes, that is interesting for me. So I began to explore it more and began to think about it more. What I find is it's beyond having the same people. So both the refineries that are being built, often the labor is mobile. So we have Indian workers and Filipino workers coming to Virginia, but also going to India because there's certain expertise and skills that's moved around. But also, I began to think about like what other similarities are there besides just the building of this infrastructure. And as I looked at plans like this, I became aware of the fact that there's no people ever when they have drawings or pictures of like the green energy projects that are still embedded in communities and still do have produce some levels of pollution that negatively impact the surrounding communities, as well as taking away space that communities occupy. These are often, people are missing from these pictures. And I began to wonder, like along these concerns of environmental justice, where are we putting these refineries and who is most impacted by them, who benefits? And trying to resist this idea, even though they are being presented as these modular global solutions for green energy, what kinds of perhaps inequalities are we once again kind of hiding underneath these discourses of the environment and the future? So one of the things that I found most interesting was that in Virginia, we compare what one of the project that's currently going forward with and how the community, which is majority minority, which is how the Virginia government characterizes it, but also which has an income that is lower than the state average for the community, as opposed, so it's a less affluent community with majority minorities residents. They're unable to stop the building of one of the projects in comparison to there's in Culpeper, which is in where residents who are majority white community and have an income higher than the state average were able to successfully stop solar panels because it would disrupt visions of both Civil War sites as well as Confederate campgrounds. And so we can think about the difference between how community, I began really interested in who's able to actually mobilize against energy projects and what kinds of energy projects actually go forward. And as I'm beginning this research, I'm finding, of course, people who are in lower economic brackets as well as minorities are being disproportionately affected. And we see this similar trends in India and Kuwait. So there's this idea of like green energy infrastructure and how it is in some ways perhaps reinforcing social inequality as well. We're trying to imagine a new future, right? And so I begin to wonder how other groups are imagining the future. And I was talking to, and this is like, and it's also kind of what I'm still looking at, but I began to talk to a group of men who had all worked in the Gulf for a long time and moved back to India. And this was during one of the climate change summits. And so there was a lot in the Indian news about how the argument is India should reduce its carbon footprint in order to meet these future, goals of reducing climate change's impact. And we were talking, and we were not talking, we were arguing. And we were arguing, and I was like, but of course India has to reduce its carbon footprint. Everyone has to reduce its carbon footprint, for climate change. Awful. And finally, one of my friends looked at me and was like, you're not listening to us. Yes, India should reduce its carbon footprint, but you, Americans and Europeans, you were able to develop and, destroy as much of the environment as you want, and we also should be able to develop. And I was like, and we're still kind of arguing here. And he said, but we understand that this should happen. And let me tell you my vision of a future. And in my vision of the future, they began to talk about the Koli community, which is an Adivasi or an indigenous Indian community. That, and they're like, this is a model for how we should understand the future. Because of the Koli community, they see everything as interconnected and everything is alive. And so they said, look, they see the sea is alive. They see that mango tree is alive. They see these flowers as alive. But they also see all of these things interconnected, that they're all responsible for each other. And they said, that is how India will develop. So we don't need these outside international standards, rather we have our own view and understanding of what the future should look like. Now, this is, of course, a small community, but this made me begin to wonder, what other stories do we have? And what other visions in the future do we have that we can begin to model? And how do these stories either reinforce government narratives, or do they push against those government narratives? Or how do they envision different ways of dealing with climate change? And this is the projects that I'm beginning now. And if you're interested in research and you're a student, I'd love to work with you. So you should come and talk to me because I have arthritis. But I'm going to end there, and I'd love to answer questions if you'd like. But thank you so much for listening.
So we have time for questions. So do people have, students have any questions they want?
Could you just extend your talk a little bit and tell us a bit more about the Virginia site? I know I've heard or read about it, but since it is so close to our turf, we've probably driven by it and might know some of those communities that you're talking about, or we should know. So could you do that for us?
Yeah, I'd love to. The comparison is between Culpeper, where so as I'm sure many of you know, Amazon has moved into Northern Virginia, and we have higher energy needs as part of it. Also, Virginia has passed legislation in which we're supposed to be moving towards greener energy and net carbon zero eventually. And so one of these plans is to build solar panels, which actually are relatively, don't produce a lot of pollution for the surrounding communities, but they are big and they take up a lot of space. And so in Culpeper, there had been a drive to, they planned to put some near Culpeper, and residents were really successful mobilizing, and they brought in historians from all over the country to talk about the importance of the Civil War, the importance of these campgrounds, and really were able to just stop that project relatively quickly. And what I find this to be an interesting contrast to is Charles City County, which is very close to here. And there was a proposed two refineries that were both supposed to be greener, they're gas. And also one has been just recently halted, I think, a month or two ago. But these refineries would process fracked gas, which we know is not super clean, and also would really release a lot of toxins into the immediate environment that would have negative impacts for the community, which is largely, again, people of color who are in the lower economic brackets or lower compared to the median in Virginia. And this community had people in the community, of course, thinking about environmental justice, environmental, and racism, have been mobilizing, and this has been ongoing since 2016 when these were first proposed. And so it's a really long and much longer journey. And it really struck me last summer when we were, you know, taking down Confederate statues and talking about the importance of Black Lives Matter from, you know, all of our public officials, yet we were continuing to build a refinery that would really negatively impact the lives of Black Virginians, and really not, I think, connecting these two things. And I think that that's part of this project, is just thinking about how do we connect these social justices with what's happening in other very localized spaces, and maybe not as overt terms, but still has these negative impacts.
And I should preface my question by saying thank you for this really illuminating and extremely clear talk. It's so wonderful to see, you know, the particular chapters of your work that are manifesting in these, you know, major, larger works of books, all coming together and interconnected. And it's such an interesting example of how you sometimes have to go very far away to see what's really affecting you also. But really, thank you for a wonderful talk.
So I know less about all these energy issues, but from what I gather, the attempt to have the nuclear power plant and some other stuff that they've done in like Surrey area where you have white but less economically advantaged people, are you seeing some comparisons that you can tease out? Because there you have race and class with those three types of comparisons.
Well,
And thank you for your talk.
oh, thank you. So it's interesting. I think this is where we ought to think about how, you know, energy projects impact people. We want to think about both what types of conditions facilitate where things are. And of course, this has to do with class, and it has to do, of course, with race, which often are closely connected in certain parts of the United States. But this, of course, is not just related to one issue, but we don't want to, my goal was more to think about ways we can draw comparisons across groups, you know, to think that these, particularly when thinking back to the history project, you know, we can watch some of these divisions kind of be developed and how they get implemented. And so thinking about how do we actually work across, and, you know, how do we make these kind of changes is really useful. And I think that, yeah, so it's an excellent question. And I think that also not reducing communities to just one thing, but rather being these complex places where, of course, there's some people who want an energy project too, because they see it as bringing jobs or other positions. Although in general, like it takes, I don't know, 10,000 people to build a refinery and 100 people to run it. So it's like not, it's not really great jobs. But there is, it's really interesting, and it also then gets, of course, embedded in nationalism. Right? So within the United States, we have a goal of being less dependent upon foreign oil or foreign energy production. So that, of course, would be part of being a good citizen, right? To participate in working towards having energy independence. And so it's not, you know, it brings in so many issues, like people into so class and race, but also citizenship status and how we understand ourselves as Americans, or how people understand themselves as Indians. And this is where I also think these different futures become so exciting. It's like understanding that there's so many different stories that we're telling, and how do we capture those stories.
Can you explain more about the vision that your friend was describing for the future? And because you said it was interconnected, but how is that connected with development? And then how are they trying to realize that vision?
Right. So this is an excellent question. So what is this vision of the future, and how are people like implementing it? And again, I want to preface this by saying this is I'm talking with the group of men who are largely illiterate and from farming communities. So there's like both an awareness of climate change, but also not government officials or leading scientists, right? They're everyday people. I think there's, and so their vision, and this is actually an argument that they make in other places, is that how we should think of ourselves. It's not as freedom isn't just being an independent person who's able to do anything they want, but rather the freedom in the future involves caring for each other and having the government care for citizens, employers care for their employees, and recognizing that we're all interconnected. And so what I find so compelling about this, so it's not, a direct policy narrative, but rather hopefully good to think with and to think if it is able to travel. It's like, how could we imagine a future instead that's not focused on individuals or even perhaps one country, but rather thinking about how we are all interconnected and how could we all work together to create a future that we, agree upon. And I think that central to that is this idea of an obligation. And that's not just like because you want to recognize somebody else's working with them, but rather it is your obligation. Like for him, it's their obligation to work with other people. And I think that that's a really different understanding of obligation than it's your country's obligation to make sure that you are able to do anything you want, right? Those are different framings for how one should be thinking the world. And so that's so it's more what right now I'm at the stage of collecting stories and to see if they do travel somewhere and how effective they are. Thank you.
I really appreciate the discussion about development and development nations impact on development because they were really developing nations figure out how they would think of it. I was wondering in terms of politics, the BJP is, I believe, still about fighting the National Party and doing the coronavirus crisis. It's like they fighting like the last presidential administration of the United States. Is it like the office in our is climate change politics kind of similar there, and that it's like some politics downplayed, other politics promoted, or was it something similar to or different than climate change politics in the United States?
So this is an excellent question. And there is one of the additional things that's very interesting about these projects that are similar in Korea, India, and the United States is that all three tend to have a large political party that closely associates one ethnicity with the nations. There's like an ethnic nationalist argument at play in many instances. And so, and it's interesting to see that how minorities are treated there, like within these contexts. But climate change is particularly interesting because Modi, so BJP is the current government in India, and the Prime Minister of India, the BJP, is Narendra Modi, who came to Houston for an event called Modi. So then he hosted past President Donald Trump, who went to India and made a speech. And interestingly, the same day that there were really violent protests in New Delhi and the citizenship amendment that people argue is discriminatory towards Muslims, Trump gave a speech in which he talked about the connections between India and the United States. And part of that was about oil and actually development of oil projects. And so the three connections are strong economy, moving towards energy independence, and fighting against terrorism. So these three themes were his story. So we do see actually a similar understanding, perhaps that's less among certain parties, it's like less about climate change, more about like nationalism or how one state advances itself. And so that here again, these stories would be a very different kind of understanding of the obligation of the state to other states, right? So it's not just about you know, the United States getting ahead or India getting ahead, but rather everyone getting ahead together. So.
Yeah, so going off of that, so the community, especially like the Adivasis, they are considered lower in the caste system, and then considering like the BJP, which is a very much Indian nationalist party, have you explored like the caste dynamics of oil in addition to class and race?
Yeah, so the what we see today is because we don't know how many Indians total migrate to the Gulf every year, but we know that roughly 1 million Indians who haven't passed 10th grade migrate, because the Indian government last that data. We know roughly 1 million Indians every year who haven't gone to 10th grade migrate, and disproportionately those migrants come. So these people who are going as like manual laborers, they are disproportionately come from minorities. So in our research, like I went through Muslims in India, face a lot of like Adivasis or indigenous Indians, in some Dalits, which would be low caste Indians that could be inclusive of Muslims, all face a lot of discrimination, and they make up the vast majority of it. So like at one research site where they're building an oil rig, it was like 54% of my interlocutors were Muslim, and more than 3/4 would identify Dalit, which would include Muslims. So, and Adivasis actually also migrate in large numbers, and might sometimes include themselves as it's now increasingly there seems to be part of the caste system for a while. There's some arguments there, but yeah. So definitely people from minorities, but also because they also tend to be poor. So yeah, it's really very interesting. But it's higher.
Sorry. We're going to continue with more questions, but I know that some people have 1 o'clock classes. So if you need to go, thanks to Fantastical, we have our banh mi sandwiches right here. So banh mi sandwiches traditionally are pork, so we have the pork ones here, but we also have chicken, tofu, and beef ones. And so if you want a vegetarian one, grab one of these as you go, and they're marked, they're labeled. So thank you, Monica. And whoever needs to go to the Travis sandwich and take off, but we have until 12, so we'll continue with the questions. Thank you.
I mean, until 1.
I'm Professor Wright. Thank you so much for such a fantastic presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your processes when you're on the ground and researching, and how you find people to interview, or you were talking a little bit about how you went to those recruiting places to find people to interview. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
So that's an excellent question, and that research is largely ethnographic, which is interesting way to do. I love it because it allows people to talk about what they want. So it involves consistent observation and open-ended interviews and things like that. But when I arrived in India, I was excited. I was going to work on this migration thing because of a previous trip. But I arrived and I just began to call recruiting agents, which are people who act as intermediaries between Indians who want jobs abroad and oil and gas companies. And everyone just like hung up on me, or like literally pushed me out of their offices where nobody wanted to talk to me. And so I became nervous that I would not be able to do research on this, and I reached out to a local voluntary association, a group of people who all volunteer to improve the lives of individuals who are living in Wright, which is a neighborhood in India. And so I was spending time with them, but I kept telling people, because I knew people from Wright, from other stories. And so I was like, oh, I'm working on this project. Do you know anyone? And I was like, no. And then eventually one day, he was like, oh yeah, I know a guy who runs a recruiting agency. And so he, after 6 weeks of me showing up to trailer, I had finally met someone in September, someone who was like, oh, I think you can talk to this person. And recruiting agents were, I think, the reason they didn't want to talk to me first was because they were worried that I was writing an expose on how they're taking advantage of poor Indians. They didn't employ us since they didn't want to talk to me. So that individual introduced me to another recruiting agent who then ran a very big company who let me spend over a year just at a recruiting agency, and I went with his employees and we went to interview people. I also, before that, I lived in Lucknow, which is in Uttar Pradesh for a couple of years, studying groups. I knew people from there. So it was largely built through relationships.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. Could you expand? Remember, we had a conversation about, you've already talked about the Virginia connection in the local way, but I recall you saying that it does touch on Asian communities within the US. So could you touch on these particular communities, where they are, and other than the labor force or migrants coming in, what communities these are specifically?
So I think that, thank you so much for that. And I think when we're speaking about minority communities in this of course includes not just, African Americans, but it also includes Asian Americans, and particularly in some of the projects in this part of Virginia, there's been a huge Filipino presence actually in working in solidarity with these communities to protest that. And I'm really excited to see how we can map these movements for environmental justice across communities. And so that's part of the research that I'm doing right now, is looking at how our different community groups, not only mobilizing within their community, but also between communities. And there's some in particular around Filipino environmental justice advocates in Newport, like closer to the
Virginia Beach?
Yeah, Virginia Beach, and other community activists, both in Richmond as well as in Charles City County, and thinking about how people build these intercommunity alliances.
That would be exciting.
So we have two last questions.
Hi, my name is Amar Malik. I work at the Global Research Institute. I'm actually from part of the Punjab on the Pakistani side, where I've lived through some of these things that you talked about. A significant proportion of the working age males have lived abroad, both in the Gulf but also in Europe. The one thing that stands out to me now, both when I go back home, but also when I travel in taxi cabs in Riyadh and Bahrain and these places, that is the role of technology. It's like, I can't tell you how many times I've been on cab rides where they would have a WhatsApp call going on constantly for a whole hour, because they're constantly in touch with their friends and family. So I wonder if you could think of, and we also know from experience in this country that technology has played a massive role in organizing protests, spreading information and so on. So if you were to look at these historical cases and compare them to what's happening now, given that there is still free access to the internet, high-speed internet for these workers, what role, if any, is technology playing in helping them perhaps organize, or whatever else you might think is a contemporary issue that they might be dealing with?
So this is really interesting, because I first became aware of this because when I got into a taxi in Dubai on my first trip there, I tried asking an Arabic for the taxi driver to take me to the mall. I didn't know how to go. He's like, I don't speak Arabic. And so then I said in English, I was like, I need to go to the mall. And he's like, I don't speak English. And so I said in Hindi, can you take me to the mall? I said, why do you live here? Why do you speak Hindi? I was like, oh, I live in Lucknow. He's like, oh, I'm from here, Lucknow. And it became this long conversation. That's how we became interested in it. So yes, but the other things, that trip was in 2006, right? So there's not this constant WhatsApp, there's not as much internet connectivity throughout India at the time. And now though, there is, so even during the coronavirus, I was WhatsApping with people I knew who were in the Gulf, and they were able to tell me about their conditions in their labor camps, and which then also allows for them to have more media or to draw attention to it, or to bring international pressure to for medications. But the flip side of social media is in India and WhatsApp, there were rumors circulating that Muslims were purposely spreading COVID and led to violence against Muslims in certain communities. And so there's both it opens up these possibilities for both workers to maintain connections at home or to talk to like people outside of who they would maybe normally be able to talk to, but also I think allows for certain types of rumors or misinformation to equally start. So it's a really complicated issue.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, do you know is there continuity over time about the predominance of Indian laborers in the Gulf being Muslim or of minorities in India? And then how does that affect the politics of labor, and in terms of, does that affect how they are seen by the host governments and their support from the Indian government over time?
So it's the continuity over time question is fascinating because in this area where we're looking at oil production, like Iran, then the Arab side of the Gulf, outside of Saudi Arabia, the British governments acting as protectorates in the Arabic speaking Gulf, and so they are really worried about outside pressure from Russians and Americans and taking away their access to oil. This is like in the early 1900s. And so they begin they pass a policy that only British subjects can staff oil projects, which means that Indians, which today are Indians and Pakistanis, but historically Indians, were like preferentially hired for oil fields. And they actually used the same networks that they used to hire indentured laborers to hire these thousands of workers that all of a sudden needed for oil projects as oil projects were valued. And then historically, the oil companies preferentially would hire Muslims because they said they didn't need separate kitchens. Then was often the argument, but I think also because they could pay people less than today. What happens is, or what the stories that recruiting agents and oil company human resources managers say, is that like as an area gets welcomed from remittances from the Gulf, we have to go to a poorer area to find people who will take these low wage jobs. And so it's like that, always kind of just going to the next poorest place to find workers. So it's not the same workers, but perhaps sometimes people who occupy the same place structurally. Thank you.
And our next talk is still in the works.
Yeah, so we were supposed to have our beautiful calendar schedule, but there are a lot of events. And so if you go to the Asian Centennial website, we'll have a lot of the events posted. Professor Rasmussen, do you want to talk about
Yes.
Sure.
September 23, there's a special event.
Yeah, thanks. Part of the Asian Centennial is an exciting event next Thursday. We have a group of 23 musicians and dancers from Ponggosakan, Bali, Indonesia. And they come from really an artistic village. They also run a summer study abroad program that several William and Mary students have attended. And they embarked upon an East Coast tour thinking that COVID would end. And we were all sort of on pins and needles wondering how it would come through, but little by little, vaccinations, seclusion, visas, plane tickets, and lo and behold, that one of their last stop on their tour is Williamsburg. The concert is at the Williamsburg Regional Library Theater, exactly a 4-minute walk from here. It's free on Thursday night. I have tickets, so we are keeping track. So I have tickets. I'm happy to hand you out, one or two if you've got people that you would like to bring along. They're also going to be doing a workshop in Yule Recital Hall, 12:30 to 2. Not sure exactly what's going to happen. Meet and greet, talk about issues of sustainability in the performing arts. Just welcome some wonderful artists from Bali. So next Thursday is the day. The group is called Sudamani, and really excited to have the co-sponsorship of like 10 different organizations on campus, including Student Assembly that gave us a nice chunk of money, thanks to the Asian American Student Initiative